My name is Ted Frantz, and it is my honor to serve as the president of the Midwestern History Association. On behalf of the association, I want to extend my gratitude to the Hauenstein Center, all of its staff, with particular acknowledgement of Director Gleaves Whitney and Program Manager Scott St. Louis. Their generosity has made this conference possible, and we can't thank them enough. So thank you again. A brief word, if I may, for those of you who missed this morning's business meeting. The Midwestern History Association is not quite in its infancy, but is still youthful. We are just 5 years removed from a conference in which bylaws and officers were elected. I encourage all of you to become dues-paying members. We have many, many attendees, far fewer members. Membership is affordable, quick, and easy. And so for more, please see the organization's website, midwesternhistory.com. It is handled through the University of Nebraska Press now. It's a streamlined process, and please, we want to grow the organization not just in terms of attendance at this wonderful conference, but also through our membership. When I first learned that Professor David Levering Lewis had accepted the Hauenstein Center offer to deliver this afternoon's keynote address, I was overjoyed. Professor Lewis's influence on the historical profession is difficult to overstate. In a career that has produced some of the finest and most wide-ranging scholarship imaginable, Professor Lewis has served with distinction at a number of top universities in the United States and overseas. He currently is Professor Emeritus of History at New York University. His 2-volume biography of W.E.B. Du Bois is noteworthy in so many respects. One sign of their brilliance is that Professor Lewis won Pulitzer Prizes for both volumes. So here is a case where the sequel is at least as good as the original. And that's a pretty rare thing indeed. His most recent book took him away from Du Bois, The Harlem Renaissance, and the making of Europe during what we used to call the Middle Ages. Yes, his scholarship is as broad as it is deep, and is a study of the enigmatic barefoot Wall Street lawyer Wendell Willkie of Elwood, Indiana. This fine biography has gotten rave reviews in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, and just about everywhere else, and for great reason. It is timely, it is thoughtful, and it is compelling. Professor Lewis's talk today is Wendell Willkie, the mid-20th century's remarkable civil libertarian and visionary internationalist. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor, and without further ado, may I please welcome to the podium Professor Lewis.
It is really a privilege to be before you, because I must tell you, I was late to discovering the Midwestern Historical Association's existence. It was founded in 2014, not so long ago, but only recently was I aware of its robust emergence, and I hope that I can be part of what is a very important segment of the large American narrative. It seems particularly pertinent given the Vice Presidency's presence and the issues that swirl around what is called nativism or isolationism or Make America Great Again, issues that were very, very central to the experience of Wendell Willkie. I begin this talk at the end. Among Wendell Willkie's last words were these: "Whatever we do at home constitutes foreign policy, and whatever we do abroad constitutes domestic policy. This is the great new political fact." Wendell Willkie wrote these words 2 weeks before his fatal cardiac seizure in Manhattan's Lenox Hill Hospital on October 8, 1944. They appear in An American Program, his little book of 10 extraordinary chapters, most of which may still profit contemporary readers, and several may even stun by their immediacy. Indeed, read chapter 8, Wilkie's proposed platform for the 1944 Republican National Convention, with its Keynesian economics, its national health care, its civil rights plank, its labor union plank, and you have a document whose rank progressivism Reagan Republicans would reject and the party of Trump vilify as communist. In his valuable edition, Wendell Willkie, Hoosier internationalist, Willkie scholar James Madison posed the poignant hypothetical. What if he, Willkie, had lived his allotted 70. What role might he have had in the Cold War? What role in the slow and painful march towards civil rights for African Americans? Tempting it is, if not irresistible, to endow posthumously Wendell Willkie with the best of our contemporary social and political convictions. And some reviewers reproached his conscientious biographer Ellsworth Barnard for excessive sympathy, an easily committed fault, as my own text sometimes betrays, as in the following sentence. Willkie's politics proved captivating because they served his ideals more than in reverse. It was an amalgam no other Republican contemporary, neat little Dewey, rigid Taft, pompous Vandenberg, precocious Stassen, possessed. Born on President's Day, 1892, in tiny Elwood, Indiana, Wendell Lewis Willkie was the youngest of 4 sons in a family of 6 siblings. The oldest, Julia, did much of the rearing after their academically advanced mother announced an end to pregnancies, passed the state bar, and joined her husband in Indiana's first husband-wife law firm. The Willkies were silver Democrats, fierce partisans of William Jennings Bryan, youngest candidate to lead a major political party in 1896. When Bryan ran again in 1900, he spent a night at Herman and Henrietta Willkie's. With them listening in and out of sight past midnight, 8-year-old Wendell and his brothers remember their father urging Bryan to play down silver, free silver, dead issue, he said, and emphasize the evils of America's new imperial adventures instead. No tub thumping of empire in the Willkie household when the stars and stripes were hoisted over Manila Bay in 1898 at the end of the Spanish-American War. Willkies ridiculed Rudyard Kipling's mawkish The White Man's Burden in jocose verses made up round the dinner table. Herman and Henrietta's ancestors hadn't fled Prussian militarism only to have their descendants end up as jingoists. The family home was unusual. Some Elwoodians called it the crazy Willkies, the site of some weird experiment in domestic living. Meals were taken opportunistically at a long table in the basement. If discussion developed or a book was waiting to be read, one bemused housewife neighbor recounted, unwashed dishes stacked up high. Parents and books fed a freewheeling disputatiousness on politics, free trade, socialism, religion, and the evils of empire. Herman regularly woke his brood with quotes from Shakespeare, addresses from Athens or Rome, or famous dates or verses they were expected to identify or complete. In fall of 1910, Indiana University student newspaper misspelled its headline, "Another Willkie arrives, minus one L." His Bloomington contemporaries would recall an unkempt, ubiquitous extrovert who favored red shirts and whose scholarly curiosity seemed insatiable and whose run of successful challenges to Greek letter society primacy was rewarded with well-merited service on several key student bodies. A one-man campaign for a radical addition to the social science curriculum distinguished Wendell's junior year. Of his coup of finding 10 students to enroll in the university's first class on socialism with Marx's Das Kapital and Spargo's History of Socialism on the syllabus, he would jest, "No wonder they thought of me as a socialist. He corrected this misperception a few years later, opining, "A man who is not something of a socialist before he is 40 has no heart," adding exculpatorily, "Any man who still is a socialist after 40 has no head." At the beginning of 1915, straitened family finances carried Wilkie to Puerto Rico after 1 year of high school teaching in Coffeyville, Kansas. Brother Fred, employed at Fajardo Pharmaceuticals, arranged a remunerative 6-month appointment as a chemist's assistant in order to pay for law school. This experience marked Wendell Wilkie deeply. After the first month, the laboratory routine and the long hours bored, as did the formal occasions when the new American overlords mixed with the island's old Hispanic aristocracy. One subject the Puerto Ricans never would discuss, he would tell a future biographer, was the state of the submerged 9/10 of the population. Wendell began writing about much of the land on horseback to see conditions for himself. As he rode with the plantation manager, a rebellious peasant suddenly scampered from the cane brake across their path. Without slowing his horse or stopping the conversation, the manager missed the man's neck but severed the shoulder with his machete. The casual violence of the atrocity stunned Wendell Wilkie to such an emotional depth that he often spoke years later of how this Puerto Rican experience kept him from thinking like a typical millionaire, even after becoming one himself. He began learning on that beautiful Caribbean island how to see and hear the obscure, uninterrogated conditions of those who survived beneath the surfaces on which powerful, prosperous, cultured people glided as by right. After Congress approved President Wilson's April 1917 war request, the Wilkie family had signed on with alacrity, firmly convinced, unlike other German Americans, that the Hohenzollern Empire was the incarnation of evil. Wendell and brother Robert were among the earliest officer candidates, commissioned lieutenants. When the guns fell silent on the Western Front, Captain Wendell Wilkie came home a confirmed Wilsonian, exhilarated by the Presbyterian president's visionary League of Nations. He expressed, though, no recorded concern about the Wilson administration's national security excesses, not even that it indicted, convicted, and sentenced to a lifetime of disfranchisement Eugene Debs, of Woodrow Wilson's bone-deep Negrophobia and silence about lynching. He would evince no written cognizance until his powerful 1942 Saturday Evening Post article, The Case for Minorities. With Americans even more determined to remain neutral in another war among Europeans 20 years later, presidential aspirant Wilkie would warn his countrymen and women again of Germany's historic militarism. Yet when he did so in 1940, it would be distinguished by an exceptional civil liberties maturity yet to be learned in 1919. Wilkie had fully expected to resume his place in Wilkie & Wilkie as the family firm's third member on Elwood's Anderson Street, but Henrietta vetoed the plan as a recipe for mediocrity. On April Fool's Day, 1920, Wendell reported to the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company in Akron, Ohio, as head of its legal department. Wife Edith and infant son Philip soon followed. Wilkie was not only a Democrat, he was a Woodrow Wilson League of Nations Democrat in an isolationist city 2 weeks after the U.S. Senate's final rejection of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. To Harvey Firestone's new lawyer, rejection of the League of Nations was a disgrace that he and like-minded men and women of Akron hoped to see reversed that November 1920. He and they utterly failed. Warren Harding campaigned from his front porch in Marion, Ohio, unflustered by rumors of Negro blood, and decisively defeated Wilson's champions, Ohio Governor James Cox and Navy Undersecretary Franklin Roosevelt. When the Wilkies left for New York City after 9 years in Akron, Ohio, not only had Harvey Firestone's prediction failed, that Wendell would never amount to much because he was a Democrat, Wendell's opposition to the local KKK, his political activism, Bar Association presidency, and multiple board service had put him atop Akron's leadership pyramid and garnered notice of Wall Street kingpins. A spectacular future lay ahead, spectacular and wholly unanticipated. At age 40, this committed Democrat and successful lawyer presided over Commonwealth and Southern, the nation's second or third largest private utility holding company. That said, Wilkie's big business success would hardly ever have put him between the crosshairs of FDR's presidency, but for the New Deal's Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, and Samuel Insull's Chicago Holding Company. When Samuel Insull's Commonwealth Edison Holding Company imploded in the Great Depression, the catastrophe was of epic proportions. Such was the power of Commonwealth Edison of Chicago that its companies were reported to serve more customers' electricity and gas in 32 states than was consumed in any other country in the world. Chicago shareholders discovered that $88 million worth of their special gold debentures were backed by only $460,000 in cash remaining. The savings of 600,000 investors were wiped out. Not all utility holding companies were precariously stacked pyramids, their capitalization unauditable, their regional services unregulated and overpriced, as with Insull's Commonwealth, Edison, but a notable number of them indeed reserved their castigation as the spider web of Wall Street. Public fury directed at men like Chicago utility kingpin raised the prospect of an entire industry being punished with federal sanctions. Campaigning 2 months before the 1932 presidential outcome, Franklin Roosevelt famously blamed the Depression's spreading misery on men like Samuel Insull and pledged federal regulation of private electric holding companies. The president's signature transforming the government's World War I power investment at Muscle Shoals, Alabama, into the Tennessee Valley Authority was among the first of the New Deal's prodigious 100 days accomplishments. David E. Lilienthal's TVA, Democracy on the March, a New Deal classic written by one of its proconsuls, described TVA as the nation's greatest peacetime marvel. 5 months before Roosevelt's inauguration, Wendell Willkie became president of Commonwealth and Southern, whose power companies of Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and parts of South Carolina and Florida served efficiently the 4.9 million white and black people of the Mississippi Valley with a fair degree of efficiency. TVA legislation was completely silent about the regional role of Willkie's company in the changed power environment. No provisions made for monetary compensation or outright purchase. Willkie's common sense demands before congressional committees and in newspaper and magazine print asked how his business could be expected to compete with a federal entity whose product was underwritten by the public treasury and whose so-called electricity yardstick, a Roosevelt algorithm, was set by policy considerations instead of market forces. He insisted that TVA's success could be accomplished far more economically in partnership with private enterprise, and he was convinced that only Roosevelt's surrender to his party's senatorial Western hardliners, Nebraska's George Norris, Montana's Burton Wheeler, and Wisconsin's Robert La Follette Jr., and to the federal bureaucracy's junta of yesteryear's best and brightest ideologues, Thomas Cochrane, Ben Cohen, and David Lilienthal, nullified the practical government business alternative advocated by experienced professionals and, above all, by the country's leading drainage engineer and founding TVA director, Arthur Ernest Morgan himself. Still, pragmatism had prevailed at first, or so it seemed. When TVA Associate Director David Lilienthal met Willkie in the last week of October 1933 at Washington's Cosmos Club, TVA Director Morgan Morgan's construction teams had just begun building the George Norris Dam, which convinced Wilkie that his Alabama power contract servicing the old World War I Wilson Dam would be needed for several years more. Lilienthal never forgot their first encounter. He left Washington's Cosmos Club somewhat overwhelmed by Wilkie's cocksuredness. On January 4, 1934, a dutiful Lilienthal and a buoyant Wilkie signed a 5-year TVA Commonwealth and Southern truce. Outwardly cordial relations between Wilkie and Lilienthal carried well on into the fall of 1934, but both Wilkie and TVA Director Arthur Morgan were ignorant of FDR's undisclosed assurances to Lilienthal that Wilkie's company would be gradually encircled by the enormous new Works Progress Administration headed by FDR's favorite consigliere, the indefatigable Harry Hopkins. On the other hand, the good faith of Commonwealth and Southern officials suddenly emerged as corrupted. The week before Roosevelt's historic visit to Tupelo, Mississippi, the first town served by TVA Electric Power and Elvis Presley's birthplace, one George Ashwander and several Commonwealth and Southern stockholders sued to enjoin C&S from selling Alabama utility properties to the TVA, virtually nullifying the Wilkie-Lilienthal truce and making Wendell a defendant against himself. "The mask is off," David Lilienthal pounced in the New York Times. "We now have in the open the clear issue between the people who use electricity and those who have controlled it." As one legal Machiavelli to another, Roosevelt affected haughty umbrage at the C&S president's legerdemain. But even so, the first Oval Office meeting between the president and the holding company executive 12 days before Christmas 1934 was marked by a superficial jollity as the two outsized egos puffed up like roosters. One of the few men FDR took a special liking to, Labor Secretary Francis Perkins believed. He hadn't expected to, but he had some of the same characteristics as himself. Even so, Oval Office jousting occurred against an ominous backdrop for the utility industry as a whole. In his State of the Union address in January 1935, the president called for the abolition of the evil of holding companies. 2 weeks later, a tight-lipped Wilkie left his second Oval Office conference confronted with the virtual company death sentence rendered. "Do I understand, then, that any further efforts to avoid the breakup of utility holding companies are futile?" Caught off guard, his chin jutting out, FDR reacted brusquely, "It is futile." With those words, Franklin Roosevelt guaranteed 4 years of judicial and media combat. "No quarter for TVA," blared Business Week as the C&S president led the attack on the draconian federal holding company legislation and coordinated 19 utility companies' challenge to TVA's constitutionality in Tennessee Electric Power Company et al. V. TVA. That May, the new fear, Wilkie's Chamber of Commerce speech became a rallying cry for millions living in fear of the New Deal's expansive power. Wilkie's apotheosis as the straight-shooting cracker-barrel David ready to face down FDR and his phalanx of brains trusters and bureaucrats truly began during the Second New Deal. "His dedication to private ownership merited praise," said the May 1937 issue of Fortune magazine. "He knows all the arguments. They are persuasive, not because they are new, but because he frames them intelligently, and hence he makes them sound new." The June Atlantic Monthly carried the high decibel, "Brace up, America," Wilkie's evocation of the people's rugged individualist roots and a call for repeal of New Deal paternalism. In early May 1938, Wilkie unveiled his liberalism address at Indiana University. Big government and its dark twin autocracy were today's dangers, he intoned. Against both dangers, he presented his credo of robust liberalism. Liberalism is neither easy nor sensational, he insisted. In fact, the liberal attempts the most difficult thing in the world, namely to strike a balance between the rights of the individual and the needs of society. He is like a man rowing a boat. He pulls left when the stream takes him right, and vice versa. On January 30, 1939, in a decisive ruling on federal regulatory power in Tennessee Electric Power Company et al. V. TVA, the Supreme Court determined that Wilkie's Commonwealth and Southern and 19 utility complainants had no standing to challenge the operations of TVA, even though, once again, the decision ignored the central issue of the authority's constitutionality, which it would never address. It quashed the private utilities industry's last argument. Quashing Wendell Willkie was another matter. When General Hugh Johnson's, FDR's alienated former NRA chief, speculated in his syndicated column about Willkie's chances of a GOP presidential underdog, the underdog served up a thigh-slapping answer. If the government takes on taking my business away, Johnson's offer is the best I've had. FDR took canny note of Johnson's speculation. The New Deal political climate had become less favorable after the 1938 off-year elections. On the morning of November 9, 1939, the country awakened to 81 new GOP House seats, 6 new senators, and 11 new governors, 3 of whom reflected the new progressivism that gained Connecticut its first GOP governorship since 1930. Suddenly, FDR made an unexpected decision to remove the everlasting CNS controversy from the 1940 presidential landscape. Wendell Willkie's biographers had speculated on the sudden denouement of the controversy. And then, suddenly, at the beginning of February 1939, after the Supreme Court had ruled for TVA, biographer Ellsworth Bernard marveled, something happened. We now know that what happened were several secret telephone exchanges between Willkie and FDR, resulting in the final August 1939 buyout of Commonwealth and Southern. FDR's bargain with Willkie could have happened 6 years earlier. The final drama on August 15, 1939 was staged with flair before newsreel cameras in the offices of the First National Bank at 2 Wall Street. Lilienthal looked the overworked federal official that he was as he handed Willkie blow-up of a check for $78.6 million, roughly equivalent in 2019 to $1.4 billion. His Time magazine cover article, all but announced his prospective candidacy for president if, Willkie was quoted to say, Roosevelt dared to run again. Until his warp speed materialization in May and early June 1940, most of the Republican Party's regulars needed help in catching up with Willkie's political prospects. The reaction of one veteran party regular, Kenneth Simpson, a New York National Committeeman, spoke volumes. When asked to pitch Wendell Willkie by a Lazar Frere director and major fundraiser, a dismayed Simpson listed the difficulties. So I'm supposed to go back to the clubhouse and tell the boys that we have to pull together now to get the nomination for Wendell Willkie? They'll ask me, Willkie? Who's Willkie? And I'll tell them that he's president of the Commonwealth and Southern. Next question will be, where does that railroad go to? And I will explain that it isn't a railroad, it's a public utility holding company. Then they will look at me sadly and say, Ken, we always thought you were a little erratic, but now we know you are just plain crazy. And that would be without my even getting to mention that he's a Democrat. This story is a good one. The truth about Wendell Willkie's unlikely run for the presidency of the United States makes an even better one. Republicans, unlike Archimedes, had found no ground upon which to stand to move the nation since the great 1936 New Deal landslide burying their humiliated candidate, Alf Landon. Yet throughout 1938, they had sensed winds of advantageous change passing over clubhouses, party headquarters, and local meeting places as the national economy barely staggered back from the so-called Roosevelt recession, the administration's near catastrophic abandonment of Keynesian pump priming for the nostrum of balanced budgets. Half the economic gains of the New Deal vanished in months, and amid claims of economic incompetence, 15 million remained unemployed. Public consternation over the president's blatant maneuver to intimidate the Supreme Court persisted. Key legislation stumbled to passage or even went down to defeat. Hence, when Republicans awakened to their stunning midterm 1938 congressional and state house successes, no consensus prevailed for a presidential candidate. Among a small group of mostly Eastern reformers, however, a twofold victory scenario emerged. To script a new GOP victory scenario for the 1940 election, then to find a surprise candidate unfettered by shop-worn partisan dogma and politically ambidextrous enough to make the reforms of the left palatable to the right and the promise of prosperity of the right credible to the left. Just off stage were the party's next presidential prospects, a pool of predictable and exciting possibilities, none of whom fit the reformers' bill. Taft, brilliant son of a former president, politically hidebound and rigidly isolationist; Vandenberg, another fierce Midwestern isolationist and champion slayer of the New Deal legislation; Dewey, a politically untested law and order wunderkind from New York; and Herbert Hoover, the economically unrepentant, dogged ex-president. No stranger to immodesty, yet Wilkie was not quite ready to believe that life after Commonwealth and Southern could lead to the Republican candidacy for the presidency. Yet he kept company these days with new admirers, greatly alarmed by Hitler's Germany, who encouraged him to believe that the Republican Party and the nation urgently needed his leadership. Alice Roosevelt Longworth's memorably mordant remark when she heard that Cousin Franklin called Wendell Willkie's supporters grassroots stuff was that they sprang from 1,000 country clubs instead. One such Wendell Willkie admirer was the literary editor, book editor of the Herald Tribune, Irita Bradford Van Doren, a brainy Alabama-born belle who abandoned her Columbia PhD studies to marry fellow graduate student and literary paragon Carl Van Doren. They worked together on The Nation, produced 3 daughters, achieved remarkable early success. He as a Columbia University professor and Pulitzer Prize biographer, she as literary book editor of The Nation, and in 1926, Sunday book review editor of the New York Herald Tribune. In 1935, the Van Dorens divorced. 2 years later, Wendell Willkie happened. As near as can be exact about these things, Wendell and Irita met at a cocktail party given by one of the most famous couples in America, Sinclair Lewis, America's first Nobel laureate in literature, and Dorothy Thompson, syndicated columnist and political scold. Irita became Wendell's great passion, and he hers. She was her lover's passport to a circle of sophisticated types who gave smart dinner parties and frequented the Algonquin Hotel. FDR, who made certain to learn about Willkie's personal affairs, can be heard on the earliest Oval Office taping system describing her as, quote, an awful nice gal who writes for the magazine, so on and so forth. Through it all, Edith Willkie compensated for the derived prestige and significance of her husband's fame, her devotion to their son Philip, and the ultimate satisfaction of knowing that Irita could never become Mrs. Willkie. From Irita, Wendell learned Eastern pronunciation, new terms, literary style. She brought him into a world where his intellect was stimulated, said a Willkie intimate. She fixed his lousy prose, Irita's daughters recalled. Irita helped him write better and think out his ideas out of genuine admiration, but she was also responsive to political cues from the publishers of the Herald Tribune, Fortune, and the Atlantic Monthly, who were beginning to regard Willkie as a plausible dark horse for the presidency. Suddenly, Van Doren found herself sharing Wilkie's mind with the managing editor of Fortune magazine, Russell Davenport, tall, superior Davenport, Yale Skull and Bones, awarded the Croix de Guerre for service in 1918 with the AEF, and a major figure in Henry Luce's publications Empire. In July 1939, Wendell was a guest at the Fortune Round Table run by Davenport. He took the whole group by storm, Davenport expostulated. As of that day, he committed himself to Wendell's political future as he raced home to tell wife Marcia that he'd met the man who ought to be the next president of the United States. Moreover, after Wilkie and Henry Luce, accompanied by a skeptical Claire Booth, finally met face to face, the Davenports, the publisher, decided that his initial confidence had been well placed. Wendell Wilkie's well-connected new sponsors helped him prepare a call to action, a penultimate brass ring declaration in the April 1940 issue of Fortune. Wendell's essay bore the portentous title, "We the People, a Foundation for a Political Recovery." We the People promised a New Deal devoid of class animus and faithful to the Great Depression reforms, a New Deal with its budgets balanced and bureaucratic waste and duplication eliminated. In truth, the people no longer wanted a New Deal anymore. We want a new world. Reader's Digest reprinted the full text, the pillars of the Fourth Estate, together with the Herald Tribune's aristocratic publisher, Ogden Mills Reed, and Times-driven Henry Luce, provided more than enough favorable commentary and publicity to transform a quixotic Wilkie phenomenon into a powerful natural dynamo. The swirl of media puffery would lead historians David Halberstam and Theodore White later to dismiss Wilkie as a creature of the Eastern establishment press lords, a Republican with sex appeal, Halberstam added. Yet Wendell defied the mold of a toady to the great financial houses and newspaper syndicates. He was his own man, principled and controversial, fair trial, a red-flagged civil liberties excursus in the New Republic 3 months before the GOP National Convention, lectured FDR's Justice Department on behalf of the imprisoned CPUSA head Earl Browder and the German-American Bund leader Fritz Kuhn. It is well to remember, iterated the author, that any man who denies justice to someone he hates prepares the way for denial of justice to someone he loves. Justice was not something to hand out at one time because it's convenient and withhold another time for the same reasons. To the person whose manifesto mobilized his generation and whose young legions would overwhelm the Philadelphia Convention, 28-year-old attorney Orrin Root goes the benefit for making an improbable political agenda viable. Root, Princeton 33, was the grandnephew of Elihu Root, successively Secretary of State and War, and recipient of the 1912 Nobel Peace Prize. Root's text bespoke 28 years of patrician self-assurance. Its argument a model of succinct exegesis, its summons a generational imperative. Root arraigned his party's presidential candidates. If in this crisis of civilization the Republican Party turns to some ponderous isolationist or to some crooning vote-getter, I say it is morally bankrupt, because he has a hatred of persecution inherited from his ancestors who fled to these shores to escape the persecution of their era. He will be the defender of our power and not the power of any institution or favored group. But the essence of his political philosophy is in his heart, as it is in the hearts of the people of the United States. Orrin Root's petition, sent to graduates of Ivy League institutions, garnered 200,000 names in less than a month from the Eastern elite. Wilkie clubs were a decided minority of the electorate, but pivotal. In his novel, Golden Age, a young Gore Vidal marveled at a political convention led by its bombastic balcony. 5 days in 1940 in Philadelphia at the GOP National Convention promised a surprised country Wendell Willkie's new world. Interior Secretary Harold Ickes believed nothing so extraordinary has ever happened in American politics as a Willkie nomination. To the much debated question, what nominated Wendell Willkie? The Christian Science Monitor's Washington bureau chief answered, an overwhelming tide of public opinion took the decision out of the hands of the delegates, and the delegates took the decision out of the hands of the party leaders. And he claimed, that is dynamic democracy at work. But rumor, and not a few credible reports of delegates having been pressured by their bank and corporation circulated for a while. CIO President John L. Lewis stunned Willkie's own party and much of the country with an endorsement over 3 national radio networks. The New York Times switched from FDR to Willkie in the last week. Ambassador Joseph Kennedy reneged on a Willkie endorsement at the very last minute after a phone call from the White House. 55 million out of a total population of 138 million voted for FDR and Willkie in an election experts said too close to call until the announced results. 38 states and 449 electoral votes for FDR to Willkie's 10 states and 82 electoral votes, and 5 million votes less than FDR's 27 million. A pretty good outcome nonetheless until Dwight D. Eisenhower's victory much later. On Armistice Day, 1911-1940, Willkie delivered a paean to constructive bipartisanship over the 3 national radio networks that generated the greatest number of laudatory telegrams then received by a defeated candidate. His was a powerful party, he stipulated. Let us not therefore fall into the partisan error of opposing things just for the sake of opposition. Willkie's loyal opposition speech would set the bar for constructive bipartisanship until his party's virtual vilification of the principle in the Obama presidency. On the morning of January 22nd, the GOP's titular leader lifted off from LaGuardia in a Pan Am flying boat to take the pulse of British endurance in the Luftwaffe's rain of fire. It was a sojourn uniquely qualifying Willkie's congressional opposition to the forces of isolationism and strict neutrality. With Willkie as presumptive head of the GOP came mothballed destroyers for Great Britain, came peacetime selective service, came Lend-Lease, came nullification of neutrality acts, came Charles Lindbergh and the America First Committee outmaneuvered, and after Pearl Harbor, his party's qualified renunciation of isolationism. Second only to the Battle of Britain, decreed Walter Lippmann, the high priest of journalism, the sudden rise and nomination of Willkie was the decisive event, perhaps providential, which made it possible to rally the free world when it was almost conquered. Lippmann's salute was not hyperbolic, but even as hyperbole, it missed the real mark of this leader's greatness. Willkie's evolving understanding of white supremacy in his own country placed him in a rare category surpassed by no major future political figure to date, the judgment of the Obama presidency still unassessed. Unquestionably instigated by the power calculus of African American ballots, as the great black migration resumed, Willkie's race relations outreach was the principal prescience of a politician ready to advance democracy through demography. The mutually egocentric and strategically bonding of the GOP's titular leader and the NAACP's permanent executive secretary, Wendell Willkie and Walter White, has been an unwritten chapter in mid-19th century civil rights. In the CBS half-hour speech to the nation from the 1942 annual NAACP convention, Willkie cast the bane of imperialisms as the essence of the fight to free peoples from its omnipresent arrogance. We seek to liberate, not to enslave, he proclaimed. But the truth was, he said, that Americans practiced within our own boundaries something that amounts to race imperialism. The attitude of white citizens toward the Negroes has undeniably had some of the unlovely and tragic characteristics of an alien imperialism, a smug racial superiority, a willingness to exploit an unprotected people. The case for minorities, like Wilkie's fair trial, was a puissant apology for the fact that it had even been necessary to write it. The Saturday Evening Post had caused a firestorm protest with the case against the Jews, an inflammatory article by a non-practicing Jew. Wilkie closed his notable Saturday Evening Post rejoinder with a warning that our way of living together in America is a strong but delicate fabric. For God's sake, let us not tear it asunder, for no man knows, once it is destroyed, where or when man will find its protective warmth again. Pearl Harbor had quieted the Nyes, the Lindberghs, the Father Coughlins, the Bilbos, for the time being, he reminded readers, but the prejudices they espoused lay ready for new marching orders. For good measure, 4 good-sized iconic photos illustrating the nation's diversity dominated the case for minorities: a Native American, an African American, a Chinese American, a Slavic American. To Wilkie, channeling the principles of the Atlantic Charter trumped an easy run for the New York governorship against Dewey. On August 26, 1942, he lifted off on a 3-month, 30,000-mile run round the world peace mission in a converted B-24 bomber to confer with General de Gaulle, the leaders of Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq, followed by 10 days in Soviet Russia with Stalin and his nomenklatura, and 7 days in Kuomintang, China with Chiang Kai-shek, and lubriciously with Madame Chiang Kai-shek. A picture-perfect gauge of the impact left in the train of Wilkie's progress was that of the Christian Science Monitor's discerning foreign correspondent. Quote, "To the semi-colonial nations of the Middle East," declared Edmund Sevens, "that transformative impact amounted to the 4 freedoms taken out of the realm of the abstract and clothed in a rumpled blue suit." Like his service to England's survival, like his circumnavigation of half the globe, and like his 1943 blockbuster book, One World, Wilkie's superordinate objective was to spare the post-war world another Pyrrhic peace as at Versailles. "The League of Nations was the religion of my young life," he said many times. 36 million Americans listened to Report to the People on the 4 national networks, but days before the 1942 midterm elections. It was a deeply thought message about the next chapter in the American adventure, an Atlantic Charter recontextualizing of American exceptionalism. His address offered a word picture of the strange new international world awaiting his compatriots' full, enlightened engagement, like it or not. On April 8, the most influential book published in the United States during World War II appeared. One World surpassed the sales of all nonfiction books since 1900, 1 million copies in 7 weeks. Wendell was to see his book materially nurture the United Nations movement underway to reification at San Francisco in June 1945. Although Wilkie's enormous popularity forced his party into formal abandonment of isolationism, it did not defeat the organizational and financial power of the GOP old guard. All had become alienated by a leader who no longer thought or spoke in their language. Even Luce had been made nervous by Wilkie's excessive liberalism. At its 1944 National Convention, the party of Lincoln would choose Dewey and ignore Wilkie, but as it did so, Wendell's Oval Office collaborator had a political epiphany. Harold Ickes joined Wendell Wilkie and his good friend Mike Coles for dinner at Manhattan's Ambassador Hotel in early June 1944. "FDR wants to know," Ickes confided, "if you would accept it if he nominated you for vice president of the Democratic ticket." Enfeebled to the point that he found it advisable not to accept his 4th renomination in person, Franklin Roosevelt, like Wendell Willkie, legatee of Woodrow Wilson's trust, understood that death was bound to claim him before his great work as architect of the peace was finished. Of all those he would have deemed worthy of his baton, and surely not his Vice President Harry Truman, it was Wendell Willkie, presumed to be in good health, but dead at 52 on the eve of the 1944 election. The Republican Party's internationalism was destined to swerve away from its optimistic Wilkian origins toward a steadily more belligerent anti-communism that became indistinguishable from imperialism in all but name. Don't stir mistrust of Russia, Willkie's major contribution in the January 1944 Sunday New York Times was a final affirmation of his ideal of coexistence, instead of the ennobling one world ideal. The trajectory would end in Henry Luce's American century, vouchsafed the precious few years more that undoubtedly would have positioned him at the center of post-war international reconstruction and domestic politics. It risks no counterfactual sin on the part of an historian to suggest that Wendell's commitment to power bloc understanding and coexistence, his first-hand familiarity with the dramatis personae of Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Asia would have expressed itself in vigorous counsels of moderation and reproach against Cold War policies that rapidly displaced the Atlantic Charter ideals he and FDR had made the vivid vision of the possible world after VE Day. Among Wendell Willkie's last words were these: "Whatever we do at home constitutes foreign policy, and whatever we do abroad constitutes domestic policy. This is the great new political fact." Thank you. I believe the protocol is to answer any question I could answer.
We have about 15 minutes for question and answers. We'd ask if you would come up to the microphones, if you could, entertain questions.
I thought I was going to be lucky.
Thank you, Professor Lewis, for such a fascinating talk. I'm curious about the perception of Willkie as an unconventional political figure in the 1940 election as a businessman turned politician, and the way that was discussed, but also I'm curious about your views of the phenomenon of businessmen becoming political leaders and whether that's an advisable turn.
Yes, and well, we've had that. In fact, I said this, and I thought I might be running on, and so I kind of exited, but I said that this biographer's Washington Post reviewer charged me with an almost reverential special pleading in his mischievously entitled "A Love Letter to an Extinct Creature, the Liberal Republican." And I said, what Professor Benjamin Waterhouse's review missed, however, is that his mirthful post-mortem glossed over an unhealthy condition in any democracy, the absence of maverick or nonconformist men and women indispensable to a re-energized politics. Without the Willkies or the Henry Wallaces, the John McCains, the Ross Perot's, or the Bernie Sanders, or even the emergent Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the left-right dyad historically degenerates into Tweedledum, Tweedledee, or ossifies into rock-hard antithesis. And I would have added maybe the businessman who, oh dear me, I'm having a senior moment. Forbes, the Forbes magazine man. C. Forbes, right. Mm-hmm. Utterly important, especially in if there is a compliment to be paid the incumbent president, it seems to me, it is that he's demonstrated all of our insufficiencies and our weaknesses, and perhaps ultimately our strengths. by putting his finger on everything that is hot button, third rail, in the most obscene and simplistic ways, and yet getting a decent response, decent response, it horrifies the rest of us. And so, in terms of race and gender and abortion and internationalism and trade, every issue now is salient. With Robert Mueller's statement, a superb statement yesterday, I have nothing more to say. He passes it on to our legislators who have got to do something. Yes, I think it'll be interesting with 22 people running for the presidency. Yes.
I can't help pushing you again on the Carnal-Facture question. I'm Jim Madison, and you quoted it. What if? You're now off the hook here. We're informal. Please, with all your wisdom, what if? What if Du Bois and Wilkie and other Americans of goodwill had gotten together in a positive way in the late 1940s when we had that glimmer of a civil rights movement, even before Brown? You know all this better than I do. What if?
That's a wonderful what if, and I'm not off the hook, but I would be off the professional obligations, I suppose, if I were to prophesy. But it is true that I think Truman's unawareness of all that had gone before his assumption of the office. And who knows, both Wilkie and FDR believed that they could read Stalin. The new book of correspondence reviewed in the New York Review, together with this massive biography of Churchill, there's a new collection of Churchill correspondence. And Churchill, unlike Wilkie and unlike FDR, thought he read Stalin as an Asiatic barbarian. You really couldn't trust them. And so it's well to keep in mind that Churchill, a wise, if bigoted statesman, felt confident in his judgments, as after all he had sat with Stalin as well just the month before to tell Stalin that the second front was not going to happen anytime soon. And that may have been really as harsh a judgment as was Churchill's an accurate read. Or, on the other hand, it may have well been that Stalin's concern about Greece was zilch, and that is really where the Cold War gets going. With Vandenberg, you remember, saying, scare the bejeebies out of the American people, and we have this massive allocation of a defense budget because of the threat of the communists and Stalin in Greece. Stalin was not interested in Greece. He found it even inconvenient. So as we go back and look at messages and State Department documents, either a more agreeable, trusting view of the Soviet Union's imperatives, or a read that they were almost global, dangerous, it can be advanced. And what happens, of course, is that the man who goes to Fulton, Missouri, to talk so dramatically of the Iron Curtain gets the narrative. But there is Du Bois, and there is Henry Wallace, and there would have been, I think, Wendell Willkie, although talking to his grandson, who said to me when he got the book, well, I do like the book, but I know my grandfather would not have been credulous when it came to the Russians. And so there you are, but that's what history is about. We all have choices, and I'm not so sure that intelligence makes the difference. Luck may make the difference. But where we're going now, of course, is the very worst of everything. And it just may be that this time some things can't be put back together. And we must say farewell to the world that was created from 45 and even survived Nixon, and even indeed was validated in a curious way by Ronald Reagan. I shouldn't prognosticate anymore unless there's someone who really has a question that sets me on my duff.
Professor Lewis, when we put Wilkie along with the presidents of the mid-20th century like Hoover, Truman, Eisenhower, Ford, and congressional figures and others like Henry Wallace, Vandenberg, Dirksen, Taft, Paul Douglas, how do you see the general role of the Midwest in American politics having evolved or changed over that period of decades?
I think I'm really not qualified to give you an informed answer. I can think just cherry picking of the man from these names. I'm reaching for the senator who was not in favor of Johnson's Great Society legislation, the Civil Rights Bill. And Johnson phoned him, Illinois Senator Douglas, and he said to him, you know, I understand your problem, but history beckons you. Not since Abraham Lincoln has the opportunity to play that role presented itself, and you can do that. And you hear in the tape recorder, the electronic taping system, Douglas saying, you really think so, Linda? You think so? And of course he did. And his endorsement of civil rights was critical. I think until our present moment, the isolationist valence of the Midwest was a great benefit. It's hard to argue that we needed to go into World War I, and that was a very close call. And it's even perhaps questionable how we got into it when the Lusitania and some other things are sinking, and why were they sunk? After all, the Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, resigns because he mistrusts the honesty of his own president. And what might have happened if we had not entered and told Lafayette we were coming? Different history. On the other hand, the resistance of Vandenberg to our bailing out Britain was very important. And yet, even before that, he had, in Republican magazine, written a remarkably enlightened piece in which he was endorsing much of the New Deal, the sociopolitics of the New Deal. And then, of course, then comes Pearl Harbor. I have just had the great honor of getting from David Wilkie the video proceedings of the interment of Senator Lugar in Statuary Hall in Indianapolis. And it was a wonderful occasion. I wish I had been there. Senator Lugar, I think, is someone whose service to his country and to internationalism, it would be hard on a chart of 1 to 10 not to put him there at 9 or 9.5. So that reflects the possibilities of heartland Solons to serve the country in remarkable ways. I don't have a theme I can put around your question. I can only think of impressionistically. And I would say this, that this association, I think, is immensely welcomed, because just a few hours ago, I was trying to get here, and when you leave the Eastern Seaboard, you are in a different mental culture indeed. And to see all of the local, the Midwestern presses with all these titles and what have you, you are aware that part of the Trump phenomenon is a legitimate feeling in the middle of the country that its interests are no longer appreciated with the saliency that they should be. That doesn't mean that the responses are going to help the people necessarily, but it is understandable. After all, the America First Committee had some of the finest signatories on it. It's been, I think, terribly misrepresented. Gerald Ford was a signator of that Yale document, and most college presidents were, and many of the local prelates were. The AFC was to save America from a second European Civil War, they thought. Now, fast forward to the results, and it seems to have been misguided in its motives.
One more round of applause.